It was a quiet morning by the lake, the kind of morning where you could hear birds waking up, the soft sound of water touching the shore, and the distant hum of someone mowing their lawn. The lake had always been the heart of that small neighborhood. Most people liked it for the view, but not everyone agreed on who controlled it. Across the water, a man named David stood by his small wooden dock. He was tightening a few loose boards, his hands steady and practiced. The dock wasn't fancy, but it was his favorite place. He loved starting his day there, watching the sun rise over the trees while sipping his coffee. Sometimes he would fish a little before heading to work. It was peaceful, quiet, and calm, until that peace was broken by one particular neighbor who seemed to have a problem with everything he did. From her backyard, just a few houses away, Linda stood with her arms crossed, staring across the lake. She didn't like what she saw. She had seen David out there several times that week, and decided that whatever he was doing must be against the rules. She was the kind of person who believed in keeping everything by the book. If someone was too loud, she called the HOA. If a fence was an inch taller than allowed, she reported it. And now her attention had turned to David. To her, he looked like someone who didn't belong. His old pickup truck didn't match the new SUVs parked in other driveways. His dock looked out of regulation, and she didn't remember ever seeing him at any HOA meetings. That was enough for her to assume he was breaking the rules. That same afternoon, Linda sent an email to the Homeowners Association board. She included pictures she had taken from her phone. David fixing his dock, David carrying fishing gear, even David waving to a passing neighbor. In her message, she wrote that a non-member was using the community lake without authorization, and that he should be stopped before things got out of hand. The HOA board met that week to discuss her complaint. They were a small group of volunteers, mostly neighbors who liked having a say in how things were run. They didn't know David well, and since his property sat near the edge of the community, they assumed he was part of the neighborhood association. They agreed to send him a warning letter. When the letter arrived a few days later, David opened it while standing on his porch. The paper was crisp and official-looking, filled with legal words and references to violations of community property use. According to the HOA, he was trespassing on shared land and making unauthorized modifications to the lake area. He was told to stop immediately or face fines. David read the letter twice, then smiled faintly. It wasn't the first time someone had misunderstood the situation. He folded the paper neatly and placed it on the table. He didn't feel angry, just amused. People often made quick judgments without knowing the full story, and in this case they had no idea who actually owned that lake. Later that evening, David's friend Tom stopped by. They sat outside near the water, watching the reflection of the fading sunset. Tom noticed the letter on the table and asked what it was. David handed it to him with a small laugh. Tom read it and shook his head. "They really don't know, do they?" he said. "Nope," David replied, leaning back in his chair. "But I'm not rushing to tell them either." David had bought the lake years before the HOA even existed. The land developer who built the surrounding neighborhood had sold it to him directly. He maintained the water, managed the small dock, and kept the place clean. But after new people moved in, the Homeowners Association was formed, and they assumed everything around the lake was part of their community. David didn't mind as long as they respected the space. But this time it seemed they had crossed a line. Over the next few days, Linda noticed that David was still at the lake every morning. She grew even more frustrated. From her kitchen window, she could see him moving around, sometimes cleaning the water line, sometimes working on the dock. She called another HOA member to complain again, saying he was ignoring their notice. By the weekend, a few other neighbors started whispering about the situation. Some thought Linda was overreacting, while others sided with her. They believed the HOA should enforce the rules and not let anyone treat shared spaces as personal property. What they didn't realize was that David was being more patient than most people would have been in his situation. One morning, while David was placing new wooden boards on his dock, he noticed a few people standing across the water taking photos. They were from the HOA, Linda among them holding a clipboard. David gave them a polite wave, but they didn't wave back. He could tell they were gathering evidence for something. He decided not to confront them. Instead, he went about his work calmly. The truth would come out soon enough. Later that afternoon, Linda and her group posted a notice on the community bulletin board. It warned residents about unauthorized activity on the lake and claimed that maintenance work was being done without HOA approval. Some people took it seriously, while others rolled their eyes. It was just another neighborhood issue, they thought. But for David, it was starting to feel like a misunderstanding that needed to be cleared up. That night, he pulled out a thick folder from his cabinet. Inside were all the official documents from years ago: proof of purchase, property maps, tax receipts, and permits. He hadn't looked at them in a long time. As he flipped through the pages, he couldn't help but smile again. Everything was in order. He wasn't just allowed to be there. He owned the entire lake. The next day, he decided he wouldn't hide behind silence anymore. If they wanted to confront him, he'd be ready. He wasn't angry, but he wanted to make sure they understood the truth clearly. As the sun rose again over the still water, David stood at the edge of the dock, looking across the lake toward the houses. He could see Linda's curtains move slightly. He knew she was watching. For a moment, he almost felt sorry for her. She had built this entire story in her head, believing she was protecting her neighborhood, when in fact, she was about to find out she had been complaining about the one person who actually owned the very thing she was defending. He took a deep breath, feeling the morning air on his face. The water sparkled under the sunlight, peaceful and untouched. No matter what happened next, he knew one thing: truth always had a way of surfacing, just like the calm ripples on the lake that morning. The next morning, David drove to the small post office on the edge of town. He needed to send out a few work documents and pick up his mail. As he waited in line, he noticed one of the HOA members, Greg, standing near the counter. Greg gave him a quick nod but looked a little uncomfortable. David could tell he knew about the situation. Small towns had a way of spreading news fast, and the lake problem was already making its rounds. When David got back home, a few envelopes were waiting in his mailbox. One was another letter from the HOA. He opened it right there on the porch. This time the tone was more serious. They said that because he had ignored the first warning, they were considering issuing fines and possibly taking legal action if he continued to use community property without authorization. David chuckled under his breath. Legal action? He knew exactly how this would turn out. But instead of reacting with anger, he took a calm breath. Getting upset wouldn't help anyone. He decided to play it smart. He'd let them make the next move, and when the time was right, he'd show them everything they needed to see. Later that afternoon, David went down to the lake again. He spent a few hours trimming overgrown reeds near the dock and picking up bits of trash left behind by visitors. He genuinely cared about the lake. It wasn't just land or property to him. It was part of his peace, a place that had helped him through lonely days after losing his wife years earlier. The sound of the water, the quiet reflection, it all kept him grounded. As he worked, he noticed a couple walking by, whispering to each other. He smiled and greeted them politely, but they didn't respond. Instead, they looked at the dock like it was some kind of crime scene. David sighed. He understood people's curiosity, but he also felt a little sad that no one had just walked up and asked him directly. The next day, he saw 2 HOA board members pull up in their golf cart near the lake. They had clipboards and were taking photos again. He waved, but they didn't wave back. They were acting as if they were documenting a big case. One of them, a tall man with glasses, pointed toward the dock and made notes. David decided to walk over. "Morning," he said in a friendly tone. "Can I help you with something?" The man with the glasses straightened his papers. "We're just doing an inspection." "HOA business," he said, trying to sound official. "Ah, I see," David replied calmly. "Well, just so you know, this area isn't part of the HOA property. You might be wasting your time." The man frowned. "Actually, it is. This lake belongs to the community. You can't just build things or host people here without board approval." David smiled faintly. "Interesting. Have you ever checked the county records?" They looked at each other, unsure how to respond. "We don't need to. The lake has always been managed by the HOA. David nodded slowly. "That's what you were told. But it's not quite true." He didn't say more. Instead, he turned back toward his dock, leaving them standing there in silence. That evening, the HOA held an emergency meeting at the community center. Linda sat at the front, clearly frustrated. She said David was ignoring the rules and that his behavior was setting a bad example. The board discussed possible fines, legal notices, and even a community petition to reclaim control of the lake. Not everyone agreed, though. A few members spoke up, saying David didn't seem like a troublemaker. He kept the lake clean, didn't bother anyone, and wasn't causing any harm. But Linda was determined. She insisted that rules were rules and no one was above them. They voted to send him one final letter, threatening legal action if he didn't stop using the lake by the end of the week. The following morning, David received that letter. This time he didn't smile. He quietly placed it on his kitchen counter, took a deep breath, and walked outside to the dock. The sun was just rising, painting the water with soft gold. He felt calm but also ready. It was time to clear the air. That afternoon, he loaded a folder into his truck, the same one he'd kept tucked away for years, filled with property papers, deeds, and maps. Then he drove down to the HOA office. When he walked in, the room fell silent. Linda and two board members were sitting at the long table reviewing papers. They looked up, surprised to see him. "Can I help you?" Linda asked, her voice firm but polite. "Yes," David said with a calm smile. "I think it's time we talk about this lake business. I've been getting your letters." She gestured for him to sit. "Good. We've been trying to resolve this matter. You're using HOA property without permission and—" David raised a hand gently. "Before you finish, maybe you should take a look at this." He opened the folder and slid a stack of papers across the table. Linda glanced at them, frowning. The top page was an old property deed, clearly marked and signed. She read the name, then looked up in confusion. "This says the lake belongs to you." "It does," David said evenly. "I bought it directly from the original developer before the HOA was even formed. You can verify it at the county office. It's all public record." The board members exchanged nervous looks. Linda flipped through the papers again, her face tightening as she realized they were real. There were signatures, legal stamps, tax records, all in David's name. "So," he continued, his tone calm but firm, "I haven't been trespassing. In fact, technically speaking, you've all been using my property for years without asking." No one spoke for a long moment. The room felt heavy. Finally, one of the board members cleared his throat. "There must be some mistake. We were told—" "I understand," David interrupted gently. "It's an easy misunderstanding. I never made a big deal about it because I wanted everyone to enjoy the lake. But I can't have people accusing me of breaking rules when I'm actually maintaining the very property you all use." Linda's face softened a little, but she still seemed defensive. "Why didn't you say anything before?" "Because I didn't want to create tension," David replied simply. "But when you start threatening me with legal action, I have to set things straight." He stood up, gathered his folder, and gave them a polite nod. "You don't have to take my word for it. Check the records yourselves. You'll see the truth." Then he walked out quietly, leaving the board in stunned silence. As he drove back home, he felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. He hadn't wanted things to get ugly, but maybe it was time everyone understood the truth. The lake was his, not because he wanted control, but because he had cared for it when no one else did. That night, the water was calm again. David stood at the end of the dock, hands in his pockets, listening to the soft sound of frogs and crickets. He didn't feel angry toward anyone. He just hoped that, maybe after the shock wore off, the neighbors would see he wasn't their enemy. What he didn't know was that the next few days would change everything. The HOA was about to face something they hadn't expected. Proof so clear it would turn the whole neighborhood's opinion upside down. The morning after David's visit to the HOA office, the small neighborhood was buzzing with whispers. News spread fast, faster than anyone expected. People who had barely noticed him before were now talking about how the man everyone thought was trespassing actually owned the entire lake. Linda woke up to a flood of emails from board members. Some wanted an emergency meeting. Others wanted to confirm if the documents were real. She felt embarrassed but tried to hide it. Deep down, she couldn't believe she had been wrong all along. Later that day, she drove to the county office herself. The clerk behind the desk typed for a few seconds, pulled up a record, and then printed a copy for her. It had David's name, the date of purchase, and the original developer's signature. Her heart sank. The proof was right there. She drove home quietly, feeling small. Everything she'd said, every complaint she'd sent, it all looked foolish now. But she wasn't the only one surprised. That afternoon, the HOA board held another meeting. David didn't attend, but his presence was felt. They sat in the same small room with stacks of papers and silent faces. One member finally spoke up. "He's right. The records are clear. The lake belongs to him, no one argued. Linda kept her head down, flipping through her notes even though she knew there was nothing to find. Another member sighed and said, "We've been hosting events on his property for years. Barbecues, fishing tournaments, even last year's holiday party, all without permission." It was a sobering moment for everyone. They realized they hadn't just sent letters to the wrong person. They had been using someone else's land and acting like they owned it. That evening, David sat on his porch as the sun dipped low behind the trees. He wasn't feeling triumphant, just thoughtful. He knew the HOA must have found out by now, but no one had reached out yet. He wasn't the type to brag or demand apologies. All he wanted was peace and respect. As he sat there, a small knock came at his door. When he opened it, he found one of the younger HOA members, a man named Ben, standing awkwardly with a folder in his hands. "Hey, David," Ben said carefully. "I just wanted to stop by. We checked the records. Everything you said was true." David nodded. "I figured you would." Ben hesitated, then continued. "Look, I'm sorry about all this. We really didn't know." Linda thought, well, she thought she was doing the right thing. "I know," David said calmly. "I don't hold it against her. But sometimes people assume too much before they ask questions." Ben smiled, slightly embarrassed. "Yeah, that's true. Anyway, the board's planning to meet again to figure out what to do next. They might reach out to you formally." David thanked him and watched as Ben left. The evening air was quiet again, but something had changed. For the first time in weeks, he felt like things might finally settle down. But the calm didn't last long. The next morning, Linda showed up near the lake, walking along the path with a notepad. She wasn't taking photos anymore. Instead, she was just looking around, almost as if seeing it all for the first time. The water shimmered softly, and the sound of birds echoed across the trees. It was beautiful, something she had never really appreciated until now. David noticed her from his dock but didn't say anything. He watched her for a few moments, then went back to sanding the edge of a wooden bench. After a while, she walked closer, stopping a few feet away. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. David nodded. "Of course." She looked uncomfortable, holding her notepad against her chest. "I came here to say I'm sorry. I really thought you were just some guy trying to take advantage of the lake. I didn't mean to cause so much trouble." David listened, his expression kind. "I understand. People like to protect what they care about. But next time, maybe just talk to the person first. It saves a lot of letters." That made her smile a little, though her eyes still showed guilt. "You're right," she said softly. "And for what it's worth, the lake looks beautiful. You've taken good care of it." "Thank you," David said. "I just try to keep it clean. It means a lot to me." There was a quiet pause. Then Linda looked around again. "I guess the board will need to apologize too." David shrugged. "No need for that. Just understanding is enough," she nodded, then slowly walked away, leaving David standing by the water, feeling a mix of peace and relief. But even though things between them had calmed down, the situation wasn't completely over. The HOA still needed to deal with the legal side. They had built a small dock extension years ago, hosted events, and even used part of the lake for their annual fundraiser, all without proper permission. At the next HOA meeting, tension filled the air again. Some members suggested trying to negotiate an agreement with David to keep using the lake for community activities. Others worried he might charge fees or restrict access. Linda sat quietly this time, letting others speak. For once, she didn't have an opinion ready. She was just listening. Eventually, Ben spoke up. "He doesn't seem like someone who wants to start a fight. Maybe we should just talk to him honestly, no threats, no letters, just a normal conversation." Everyone agreed. They decided to send David an invitation for a friendly meeting to discuss the lake's future. When David received the letter a few days later, he smiled. The tone was completely different this time. No threats, no legal words, just a polite request to talk. He wrote back saying he'd be happy to meet. On the day of the meeting, the board gathered at the community center again, but the mood was lighter. David arrived a few minutes early, greeted everyone with a handshake, and took a seat. "Thank you for coming," Ben started. "We just wanted to make things right. We know we overstepped, and we'd like to find a way to work together. The lake means a lot to the neighborhood, and we'd like to keep it that way. With your permission, of course." David nodded thoughtfully. "I appreciate that. I've never wanted to keep anyone from enjoying it. All I ask is respect. I've been maintaining the lake myself for years, clearing trash, treating the water, fixing the dock. I just want people to care about it the same way." The room was quiet for a moment, then Linda spoke softly. "We'll make sure of that." Everyone seemed to relax after that. The tension that had built up for weeks finally started to fade. When David left the meeting that day, the sun was shining brightly outside. The air felt lighter, fresher. He knew it wasn't over yet, there would still be more to discuss, but at least now, they were talking instead of fighting. That evening, he walked back down to the lake. The water reflected the pink sky, calm and peaceful again. He smiled to himself, feeling grateful that things were finally changing. What David didn't know was that his quiet patience had earned him more respect in the neighborhood than he realized. People had started to see him differently, not as an outsider, but as someone who truly cared about their home. And though the HOA had learned a hard lesson, the best part was that everyone had a chance to make things right. Days passed quietly after the meeting. The air around the neighborhood felt lighter. For the first time in weeks, people were smiling again when they passed David on their morning walks. Some even waved, though a little shyly, unsure if he was still upset. David always waved back with a calm smile. He wasn't the kind of person to hold grudges. The HOA board had kept their promise. They stopped sending notices and instead focused on understanding how things really worked with the lake. They arranged for another meeting, this time not at the office, but right by the water. David agreed to join them there. He thought it was a good idea. People talked better when they were outside, away from papers and rules. On the morning of the meeting, the sun was warm, and a soft breeze rippled across the lake's surface. David arrived early and set out a few chairs under the shade of an old oak tree. He didn't dress fancy, just wore his usual jeans and a clean shirt. A few minutes later, the board members arrived carrying notebooks and a cooler with drinks. They greeted him politely, and soon everyone was seated, facing the calm water. Linda sat quietly, looking around as if she was seeing the lake differently this time. Ben started the conversation. "We wanted to come here today to thank you, David. The more we've learned about this place, the more we realize how much work you've done to keep it beautiful." David smiled. "It's nothing special. I just love this lake. I always have." Linda nodded slowly. "I have to admit, I used to take it for granted. I never realized someone was taking care of it all this time." David glanced at her and gave a small smile. "It's easy to miss the quiet work. Most of it happens when nobody's watching." That broke the tension, and soon everyone began to talk more freely. They discussed ideas about how the community could help maintain the lake properly. Maybe organize monthly cleanups, add signs to stop littering, and even set up a small picnic area. David liked the sound of that. "As long as everyone respects the space, I'm happy to share it," he said. They agreed to draw up a new arrangement. David would remain the legal owner, but the neighborhood could use the lake for recreation, under a simple agreement that everyone helped keep it in good shape. No more misunderstandings, no more letters, just cooperation. By the end of the meeting, everyone seemed genuinely happy. Linda even brought out a small box of muffins she'd baked that morning as a peace offering. They all laughed and shared stories, sitting together by the water until the sun started to sink behind the trees. It felt like the start of something new. Over the next few weeks, the change was easy to see. Families began visiting the lake more often. Children played by the shore, couples walked hand in hand, and older neighbors sat on benches watching the sunset. The place that had once been a source of argument had turned into the heart of the community again. David would often see people helping out, picking up trash, trimming grass, or repainting the small fence near the entrance. Every time he saw it, he felt proud, not because the lake was his, but because it was finally being treated with the care it deserved. One afternoon, as David was fixing a loose railing, a young boy rode his bike up and stopped beside him. "Hey, mister," the boy said shyly. "My dad said you own the lake. Is that true?" David chuckled. "That's what they say," the boy grinned. "That's cool. My friends and I love fishing here. Thanks for letting us come." David smiled warmly. "Just make sure you don't leave your soda cans behind." The boy laughed and nodded before pedaling away. Watching him go, David felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a quiet sense of belonging. But not everyone was at peace yet. Linda still struggled with guilt. Every time she saw David, she remembered how she had judged him without knowing the facts. One evening, as the sky turned orange, She walked over to his house with a small envelope in her hand. David was sitting on his porch, reading a book. When he saw her, he stood up politely. "Hi," she said softly. "I hope I'm not bothering you." "Not at all," he replied. "What's on your mind?" She held out the envelope. "I wanted to give you this. It's a letter." I didn't know how else to say what I needed to. He opened it carefully. Inside was a short note written in neat handwriting. She apologized again, not just for the complaints and letters, but for assuming the worst about him. She wrote that the whole experience had taught her something important, that people aren't always what they seem, and kindness often hides in quiet corners. David looked up after reading it. "Thank you, Linda, that means a lot. I know you were just trying to do your job. It takes courage to admit a mistake." She smiled with a bit of relief. "I guess I learned that rules don't always tell the whole story. Sometimes you just need to talk to people." He nodded. "That's true. Talking solves more than paperwork ever will." From that day on, their relationship changed. They weren't close friends, but there was respect between them. Linda started visiting the lake on weekends, sometimes bringing her dog or just sitting quietly with a book. Whenever she saw David, they shared a wave and a small smile, a silent acknowledgement of how far things had come. Months passed, and the neighborhood began planning their annual summer festival. The HOA suggested hosting it by the lake again, but this time they wanted to make it official. They went to David and asked for his blessing. He didn't hesitate. "Of course," he said. "Just promise me one thing. Keep it clean and make sure everyone has a good time." The festival turned out to be the biggest one yet. There were food stalls, music, children's games, and laughter echoing across the water. As the evening sky darkened and lights reflected on the lake's surface, people gathered around for fireworks. David stood near his dock, hands in his pockets, watching the bright colors burst across the sky. He heard someone say, "It's hard to believe we almost lost this place because of a misunderstanding." He smiled quietly. That was the beauty of it. Out of all the tension and conflict, something better had grown: understanding, unity, and respect. When the fireworks ended, Linda walked over and stood beside him. "You know," she said, "this might be the best festival we've ever had." David nodded. "It's the people that make it special." They stood there for a moment, watching the ripples of light on the water. The same lake that had once caused so much division was now a place that brought everyone together. As the night settled in, the laughter of families and the music of crickets filled the air. David took a deep breath, feeling grateful. For him, it wasn't just about owning the lake anymore, it was about sharing it, about seeing people find joy in a place that meant so much to him. And though he knew challenges would always come and go, he also knew this: peace had a way of returning. Just like the calm after every storm, when the news about the lake's real ownership spread across the neighborhood, the entire mood of the community began to shift. What had started as a simple complaint turned into something much bigger, something that made everyone rethink how they treated each other. The HOA members, embarrassed by the way things had unfolded, decided to call for an emergency meeting. They wanted to discuss what to do next because they realized they had crossed a line. Some of them had used that lake for years, holding events, barbecues, and fishing contests without ever knowing that it wasn't technically community property. Now they stood at risk of losing access to it completely if the owner decided to press charges or put up fences. But David wasn't that kind of man. He had never been interested in making enemies or proving himself right in front of others. He loved peace, and more than anything, he loved the lake. It reminded him of quiet mornings, soft winds, and the way sunlight danced across the water's surface. It was never about power for him. It was about respect. A few days later, David received a letter in his mailbox, this time not from lawyers or the HOA board, but from one of the board members themselves. It was an apology, handwritten and sincere. They wanted to meet with him, not to argue, but to make things right. When the day of the meeting arrived, David walked into the small community hall. The atmosphere felt tense but respectful. People who had once avoided looking at him now greeted him with nods and quiet smiles. Linda was there too, sitting near the front, her expression unsure but humbled. She avoided eye contact at first, but when David entered, she stood up and took a slow breath. "I owe you an apology," she said softly, her voice trembling a bit. "I made a lot of assumptions without knowing the facts. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood, but I ended up causing a mess. I'm sorry, David didn't gloat or hold it over her. He simply nodded and said, "It's all right. I know you were trying to do what you thought was right. Sometimes things just get lost in communication." That simple response broke the tension in the room. Everyone seemed to relax, realizing that this man they had labeled as an outsider wasn't trying to fight them. He was trying to live peacefully among them. David took out a few papers from his folder, the same ones he had shown the board earlier. "I don't want to take the lake away from anyone," he said calmly. "I bought it years ago because I wanted to protect it. I've seen too many beautiful places get ruined by people who don't care. I've always taken care of the dock, the water, and the wildlife here. I just wish people would have come to me first before assuming the worst." One of the board members, an older gentleman named Tom, leaned forward and asked, "So, what happens now? Do you plan to restrict access?" David shook his head. "No, I'm not here to make life harder for anyone. I just want people to respect the lake. No trash, no loud parties, no cutting corners with maintenance. If we all share responsibility, everyone wins." The room filled with quiet murmurs of relief. They hadn't expected forgiveness, much less a fair offer. "I'll even sign an agreement with the HOA," David continued, "so residents can continue using the lake. We'll make it official. That way there's no confusion in the future." The members quickly agreed. It wasn't just about keeping access. It was about building trust again. After the meeting ended, Linda walked up to David outside. The cool breeze from the lake brushed through the trees, and for the first time in months the tension between them was gone. "I really am sorry," she said again, her eyes soft. "I judged you before I even tried to talk to you, I think. I just got too used to being on the defense all the time." David smiled slightly. "It happens. Sometimes people forget that talking solves more than shouting ever could." From that day on, things changed around the neighborhood. The residents began treating the lake with new respect. Families cleaned up after themselves. The HOA organized volunteer days to maintain the dock, and kids learned to fish under David's quiet supervision. Even Linda started to visit the lake more often, usually early in the morning when it was quiet. She'd see David there sometimes, sitting by the water with a cup of coffee, and they'd exchange polite nods. There was no tension anymore, just quiet understanding. The story of what happened spread beyond the small community. Other nearby neighborhoods even heard about the man who owned the lake the HOA complained about. It became a gentle reminder for people to check facts before jumping to conclusions, and more importantly, to treat others with kindness before assuming they're wrong. For David, life went back to its calm rhythm. Every morning he'd walk down the small wooden dock, breathe in the crisp air, and look out at the water. It sparkled just like it did years ago when he first bought the place. But now it wasn't just his lake. It was a place where people came together instead of fighting. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the lake in shades of gold, David sat in his old chair listening to the soft splash of the water. A few kids laughed in the distance, their fishing lines dangling off the dock. A heron flew low across the surface, its wings brushing against the water. He smiled to himself, realizing that this was exactly what he had always wanted. Not power, not control, just peace. The kind of peace that comes when people understand each other and learn to share what matters most. And though no one talked much about that old complaint anymore, everyone remembered the lesson it carried. The neighborhood had become stronger, friendlier, and more aware. The lake wasn't just a piece of property. It had become a part of their lives. A quiet symbol of how a single misunderstanding could turn into something good when handled with patience and grace. That evening, as the sky turned purple and the last light shimmered across the lake, David leaned back and closed his eyes. The world felt still. Somewhere nearby, Linda's laughter echoed softly as she walked her dog along the trail. It was simple, peaceful, and full of life, the way it should be. And in that calm silence, the lake stood as a reminder that not every fight needs a winner. Sometimes the real victory comes from letting go, forgiving others and allowing understanding to take its place.